On the 7th of May 1941, only 6.5 weeks before the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, at a large meeting of the Red Army Command in the Kremlin, Major General of Aviation Alexander Ivanovich Filin made a report on the state of the Air Force. Present at this meeting, amongst many others, were Stalin, Voroshilov, Timoshenko, and Budyonny. Filin complained at infringements of Soviet airspace by the then still Nazi ally of the Soviet Union. "It's impossible to understand what is happening," he said. "The Germans can blatantly fly over our territory in impunity, and our Air Force does not seem to notice this." He then went on to criticize Soviet production techniques. "New airplanes are not just unacceptably slow, but the speed at which they are sent for testing is also slow, and the speed at which they are put in production is even slower. And of course the flight crews are learning how to fly them at a snail's pace." Filin went on to say that the Pe-8 bomber was an example of a good aircraft. However, the designer, Vladimir Petyalkov, was then under a Soviet cloud. On the 21st of October 1937, Petyakov was arrested together with Tupolev and the entire management of the aircraft factory. Accused of trumped-up charges of sabotage, espionage, and of aiding the Russian Fascist Party, many were executed. In 1939, he was moved from a prison to an NKVD secret plant for imprisoned aircraft designers near Moscow, where many of his former colleagues had already been sent to work. Petyakov was given the task of designing a high-altitude fighter, which he successfully accomplished. However, operational experience in the Soviet-Finnish War of 1939-1940 showed that this was not what the Soviet Air Force needed, and Lavrenti Beria, who knew nothing of aviation but was head of the NKVD, ordered that the fighter be designed as a dive bomber, with the promise that Petyakov and his colleagues would be released on its successful completion. Now, I'd just like to put this point that I myself don't know anything about aviation, but the idea of a high-altitude dive bomber seems to be a little ridiculous in my opinion. If anybody thinks that this is not a contradiction in terms, please do write it down in the comment section below. Stalin, of course, who was listening, and he was aware of who was in prison, and he retorted, "But some military men believe that we do not need such an aircraft." To which, with his characteristic directness, Filin responded, "You are wrong, Comrade Stalin. Without such a machine, we cannot win a major war against a strong enemy." Now, correcting Stalin was not a good survival technique in the Soviet Union. Soon it became known to Stalin that during the tests of the MiG-3 fighter in the Air Force Research Institute, a shorter range was obtained than during a specially organized flight from Moscow to Leningrad. Stalin ordered an investigation by Georgy Malenkov, who had already distinguished himself in Stalin's purges, and Semyon Timoshenko, the People's Commissar of Defense. These people were far from understanding the intricacies of flight tests. The commission ignored the fact that during the flight from Moscow to Leningrad, the MiG-3 was equipped with an additional device that allowed the pilot to maintain optimal engine operation. The Soviet Union was a backstabbing bureaucracy. Unlike in companies today, however, where one gets backstabbed and at worst one loses one's job, in the Soviet Union, one could lose one's life. And once somebody fell victim to backstabbing, more backstabbers would join in to protect their own lives and positions. Some chief designers claimed that Filin underestimated the data of the test aircraft. He was also accused of the fact that the new fighters, including the Yak-1, were put into mass production without conducting proper military tests, although it was the very same Filin who insisted on them. A report reads as follows. In February 1941, the Air Force Research Institute performed long-range flights on 2 MiG-3 aircraft, which gave results of 820 and 857 kilometers instead of the specified 1,000 kilometers. The result was a consequence of the inability to use the altitude corrector, a device that saved fuel at high altitudes. This was written in the official report of the Air Force Research Institute. So new tests were done with the use of the high altitude corrector, which showed that the MiG-3 is capable of flying 1,000 kilometers. The report of the Design Bureau, in which the results of the performed flight were set out, caused, however, completely unexpected consequences. Somewhere they compared the results obtained by the Design Bureau with those obtained at the Air Force Research Institute, and, without going into the essence of the matter, concluded that the Institute deliberately underestimated the flight data of the MiG-3 aircraft. And now I quote, "Organizational conclusions followed." That is Stalinist language for heads must roll, and probably literally. The Commission demanded that Filin be court-martialed. They also decided to sack a group of engineers and test pilots at the Air Force Research Institute. Filin was arrested on the 23rd of May 1941, although his arrest warrant was not ready until the 31st of May 1941. As this was the Soviet Union under Stalin, the NKVD officers concerned, headed by Bogdan Kobulov, decided not to look into the technical details of aviation, but instead fabricate an anti-Soviet conspiracy. Alexei Shakurin, who was People's Commissar of the aviation industry of the Soviet Union from 1940 to 1946, wrote the following. Now, he was also arrested and spent several years in Stalin's prisons until the death of the dictator. So, to return to what he actually wrote. Once Stalin, after discussing some aviation issue with Filin, invited him to dinner. As I remember now, Alexander Ivanovitch's beautiful, pale face, slender figure, attentive blue eyes and a smile. At dinner, Stalin asked Filin about flights and airplanes. He was interested in his health. Filin had a sore stomach. It seems he had an ulcer. He asked if Filin liked the wine. Filin replied, "Yes, very good wine, not too strong and pleasant." Then asking what kind of fruit Filin liked, he ordered that some fruit and a few bottles of wine be brought to his car. He looked at him all the time, affably and amiably. A few weeks later, as soon as one designer reported, "Comrade Stalin, Filin is slowing down the results of the tests on my fighter. He's making all sorts of claims." Then a sharp turn took place in the fate of Filin. "How so?" Stalin asked. "Yes, he says the plane is flawed, but I say that the plane is good." Beria, who was present, muttered something to himself. One could only understand one word: bastard. And a few days later, it became known that Filin had indeed been arrested. After some time, I tried to help Alexander Ivanovich, but nothing came of it. During interrogations, Filin was tortured, but he did not admit to the trumped-up charges. Major General Ivan Kristyanovich Pauka, a teacher at the General Staff Academy, his cellmate, supported him as he could. "We must hold out, Alexander Ivanovich. The time will come. Perhaps we will be gone by then, but the truth will prevail." In the meantime, on the 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. A large part of the Red Air Force was destroyed on the ground in the opening hours of the assault, proving Filin correct. From the 15th of September 1941 to the 7th of January 1942, Filin wrote to Stalin, Beria and Voroshilov, in which he argued his innocence. But it was completely pointless. Maybe the letters didn't reach the addressees. Well, Stalin was known not to respond to such messages, although he did read them. Or maybe it was just that his fate was completely insignificant in what must have appeared to be the collapse of the Soviet Union. Despite the urgent requirement of people like Filin, who had expert knowledge and experience, he was shot on the 23rd of February 1942. Long before he was shot, it was clear that his suggestions were right. By the end of the war, some of the aircraft that helped achieve the Soviet victory were those he had worked upon, such as the IL-2, MiG-1, Yak-1, Lag-3, PE-2 and PE-8. Major General Ivan Kristianovich Pauka, the person who Filin had shared a cell with, also died in prison in May 1943, despite the urgent need for experienced officers like him. By killing such people as Filin and thousands like him, Stalin's regime to a large extent contributed to the Nazi war effort against the Soviet Union and added to the suffering and deaths of tens of millions of Soviet citizens.